Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason, where truth matters at Christian-apologist.com. I recently came upon a debate between an atheist called Alex O'Connor, who goes by the Cosmic Skeptic, and a Christian called Dinesh D'Souza. And they debated whether or not the Bible is true on the Pangburn channel. And so I watched this part of it, and I was wanting to comment on what Alex said. So what the approach that Alex used to claim the Bible wasn't true is he looked at some of the things in the Old Testament, which were some atrocities when we had unfortunately, some battles and wars and things like that, and slavery in the Old Testament. And he posited that the Old Testament is unjust. But then he went to the New Testament, and this is the part I'm going to address today because he kind of picked apart a few things in the New Testament that he thought gave us evidence that the New Testament is not valid, not reliable, and not true. And so I think that Dinesh D'Souza, instead of addressing each of these points, Dinesh basically had an overall idea that the Bible is a revelation from God, going all the way back to Genesis, when God formed the earth and made man and woman in his image. We're made in the image and likeness of God. And so I think that was a good approach, but I think it would have been ideal had he addressed some of these points by Alex. And so since he didn't address those, I think I'm going to, because I think other atheists might benefit from hearing this. And it would be helpful also for other Christians when they're talking to atheists. If the atheists pull out some of these points, see, Christians will have a response. So let's listen to what Alex has to say. Alex O'Connor, he's a person from the United Kingdom. I guess he went to Oxford, I believe. And Alex, if you see this video, if you happen to watch this, I would gladly have a conversation with you about Christianity and how it's true. So I do believe the Bible's true. So here we go.
This is where I think we have to move to the New Testament, because the genre of the gospel seems to be historical biography, unlike the mythology of a book like the Psalms or Genesis or Job. And here there's a lot to talk about. We begin with the birth narratives. There are two birth narratives in the Gospels, in Matthew and Luke. Both give different accounts. Both have a genealogy of Jesus, for example, but the genealogies are different. I'm told this is because one records Mary's genealogy and one records Joseph's. You can do this if you like. It doesn't seem like the most natural reading of the text if you're not already predisposed to synchronize the accounts.
I really have no problem with the genealogies. I don't see a problem with it coming from different angles. The really interesting thing that you might want to note about the genealogies, though, is how they were very influential, and there was a reason for their inclusion. The reason is because the Jews had pretty much gone underground. Ever since the time when the Second Temple was built, right around the time of 516, 516 BC, we have the building of the temple, and a lot of the Jewish people did not have a king. You know, their last king basically had been killed under Nebuchadnezzar, and that was around 586 BC. And so the genealogy basically is connecting Jesus to the ancient kings and going all the way back. One of them goes back to Adam and the other one goes back to Abraham. And so the genealogies were very important in connecting Jesus to the stump of Jesse, okay? Because Jesus came from the line of David. And so it connected him to that through both parents, okay? So through his legal father, Joseph, and also through his biological mother, Mary. Now, just as a quick little side note, one of the recent findings from scientists relating to Mary is this thing called microchimera. And it's the presence of cells in a mother's body from the children that exist far after the children have been birthed. In other words, you retain some of the cells from your babies when you're growing the babies in your womb as a mother. And so scientists have found that these cells help to fight off disease, and they are definitely beneficial for the mother. And that's pretty neat when you think of Mother Mary carrying the divine and human Jesus, having a little bit of divinity in her, which is a pretty neat thing. So anyway, I'm digressing a little bit, but let's keep going, listening to Alex here.
Then we have, for example, the flight to Egypt, which is only recorded in Luke, which is difficult to reconcile with Matthew's account that they went to the temple in Jerusalem instead. But more importantly, Matthew then says that the family traveled to Nazareth, and he says, "So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he shall be called a Nazarene," quoting the prophets. Now you'll notice if you read an online Bible that where the Old Testament prophets are quoted, there's a little footnote telling you what the prophecy is. In this case, you won't find one, because the prophecy simply doesn't exist. It's not there. There's no.
Okay, let's address these points. So, I have talked a lot about Matthew and Luke in the past, and I have addressed videos by people like Bart Ehrman. A lot of people make the assumption that Alex makes here, and that is that it's sort of a snapshot in time, that both Matthew and Luke capture the same exact snapshot in time, but they're different. Okay, so Luke starts off with the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, who were older and who ended up having John the Baptist. And then, of course, he shares the story of Mother Mary finding out from the angel Gabriel that she is about to be the mother of the ruler of the world. Think about Revelation 12, the mother of the ruler of the world. And so it's a pretty cool thing that she discovers that, and she ends up with Joseph. They end up, according to that, they end up meeting up with shepherds and angels, and Jesus then is presented in the temple, and Simeon tells Mary that she is going to have her heart pierced. And of course she did when she was at the foot of the cross when Jesus had been crucified. So her heart was definitely pierced. And according to tradition, she was very aware of the way that Jesus was going to die throughout his entire life. And so that's a pretty interesting thing from the time when Simeon gave her that warning. And then, of course, when Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, he also shared the truth with his mother. And so then we go over to this idea of Matthew. Now, Matthew gives us a 2-year window of time. It's not just in this first 8 days or so. Matthew basically talks about the birth of Jesus and about how Joseph wanted to put Mary away when he found out that she was pregnant. He was betrothed to her, which is even more than engaged. It's pretty much married to her, but he was busy preparing the house, which is sort of how Jewish customs were. And he was thinking about putting her away, but then an angel appeared to him in a dream and told him not to put her away, that she had been, of course, overshadowed by the Holy Spirit. Now, that, of course, is also very reminiscent of the way that the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament was overshadowed by the Holy Spirit. And so the wise men came, they had followed the star, and they first stopped in with King Herod, and they told King Herod that they were following the star because, of course, the king of Jerusalem, the king of the world, was born in there. And so King Herod said, oh, when was this king born? Well, they must have said within the last 2 years, because King Herod decided to kill all the babies under 2 years. So that gives us a 2-year window of time in the book of Matthew. And then around that same time, the parents, Joseph, Mary, they received also the revelation that they needed to go. They needed to escape. So they escaped to they escaped to Egypt with the young boy Jesus. And so that occurred. And so it's a pretty good thing. So let's talk about this branch that's Netzer. He talks about Nazarene, of course. If you see that, you'll see that in Matthew 2:23. We've got a reference to the Nazarene, and that is a reminiscent of the branch, which was also called Netzer in Isaiah 11:1, saying that Jesus was basically going to be born, is going to be a branch. We've got a lot of allusions to trees, and it's the righteous reign of the branch. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. Okay, so the branch is another word for Netzer, and that can bring us back to this important verse about the Nazarene. But it also is reflected in the deuterocanonical text, the wisdom of Sirach. So I'm going to read you these versions. It's in 24, starting with 10. It says, in the holy tabernacle I ministered before him, and so I was established in Zion. In the beloved city likewise he gave me a resting place, and in Jerusalem was my dominion. So I took root in an honored people, in the portion of the Lord, his inheritance. I grew tall like a cedar in Lebanon, and like a cypress on the heights of Hermon. I grew tall like a palm tree in Engedi, and like those rose plants in Jericho. Like a beautiful olive tree in the field, and like a plane tree I grew tall. Like cassia and camel's thorn I gave forth the aroma of spices, and like choice myrrh I spread a pleasant odor. Like galbanum, onycha, and stanked, and like the fragrance of frankincense in a tent. Now notice the myrrh and the frankincense. Let's recall what the wise men brought to Jesus: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Okay, so like a terebinth, I spread out my branches, and my branches are branches of glory and favor. Like a vine, I caused favor to bud, and my blossoms became fruits of glory and of wealth. Come to me, you who desire me, and eat your fill of my produce. For the remembrance of me is sweeter than honey, and my inheritance sweeter than the honeycomb. Those who eat me will hunger for more, and those who drink me will thirst for more. Holy cow, what a reference to the Eucharist. Beautiful stuff. So let's keep going.
No such thing. So there are two options here. Either Matthew made up this prophecy or got it wrong, in which case the New Testament is mistaken, or the prophecy does exist, but for some reason fell out of our scriptural tradition and now no longer exists.
See, again, it's unfortunate because Alex has a buried assumption here that the nativity scenes sometimes that we see at Christmas, where it has the wise men and the shepherds and Mary and Joseph and Jesus all together, they're inaccurate, unfortunately, because you can see if you read Matthew without this long-held assumption, then you're going to see it's actually over a 2-year period. And that's why King Herod said he's going to kill all the kids under 2.
Which makes the accuracy and at least the completeness of the Old Testament suspect. So again, I'd like to ask directly which it is. Finally, I suppose I should mention
I bring up the deuterocanonical books, by the way, because Catholics and Greek Orthodox have these deuterocanonical books, and they've always had these deuterocanonical books within the Bible text. The original King James from 1611 also contained the deuterocanonical text, including the one I just mentioned, which is the Wisdom of Sirach. And so there are 7 additional books. According to Protestants, they think Catholics added it. That's what Mike Winger says. He thought Catholics added these books to the Bible, but actually, no, these books were originally in the Bible, in the Latin Vulgate, for example, under Jerome. And Jerome recognized that maybe they weren't of the same status as what they would call the canonical books. However, they were still included, the 73 books. And so that's important to note because that's why I went to that particular text. I think that that also points out the importance of the Eucharist, highlights the importance of the Eucharist. And I think it's something that you should take into account. Its validity. I think a lot of the taking these books out, which occurred in the 1900s in the United Kingdom, ironically, taking those books out, unfortunately, has diminished our full message that we have from God.
Contradictions that a lot of people point to in the Gospels. Some of these, I think, are legitimate, some are not. I'll give you some examples very quickly of Gospel contradictions that I do think are real contradictions. First, the date of Jesus' crucifixion. Was it before the Passover, as John states, or was it after the Passover, as the Synoptic Gospels state? Second.
Okay, let's address that. So in John's Gospel, he uses Judean reckoning of time. And in the Synoptic Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they use what they call as Galilean references to time. And so Galilean time, when you're talking about a day, it goes from sunrise to sunrise. And Judean reckoning basically has a day beginning at 6 p.m. So in Judean reckoning, John has the day beginning at 6 p.m. And so John's day that begins at 6 p.m. is the Passover, and the Matthew, Mark, and Luke's day at the 6 p.m. beginning is Nisan 13 and Nisan 14. So according to numerous people, the Pharisees celebrated the Passover on Thursday night of the Passion Week, whereas the Sadducees would have celebrated it starting with the slaughter of the lamb at 3 p.m. on the following day, on Nisan 14. And so what's interesting about that is when you have the reckoning from the three Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we've got the whole story of Thursday night being when they had the Passover dinner. And then we have John's reckoning where he's talking about the Jesus on the cross is the lamb. At 3 o'clock, Jesus had given up the ghost, if you want to say that. And so that's when the lamb died, just at the same time when they were sacrificing the lambs. In other words, there's 2 different ways to look at time here, the Judean reckoning versus the Galilean reckoning, and many others have written about this.
Jesus is sending out his disciples to teach. In Mark, he tells them to take nothing with them except a staff. In Matthew and Luke, he says, take nothing with them, including no staff. So do they take a staff or do they not? A pedantic contradiction, but a contradiction nonetheless, and one that's led people like Barnabas Ahern to write entire articles on this. And Augustine himself actually distinguished between a literal staff and a metaphorical staff to explain this difference. Anything, I suppose, except considering the possibility of even the most minor of gospel contradictions.
That is I would just say that particular gospel contradiction. I don't have a problem with going with what Augustine said on that. And I also think that it's such a minor thing to say that the whole Bible isn't true based on if one gospel talks about a staff and the other says, don't take a staff. Okay. So that one I'm not going to get too much into. Let's keep going.
Contradictions. Third, Jesus flipping the tables at the temple. A famous story, but did you know that in the Gospel of John, this takes place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry? In the Synoptics, it takes place near the end. So when
Actually, sometimes we have multiple events happening. There could have happened. There's a couple of different thoughts on that. Some have said that maybe there were multiple times when Jesus flipped the tables in the temple. The other thought is that the only book that really is striving for chronological consistency is the book of Luke. He said he wanted to write an orderly account of the events. And so if you were trying to figure out when things occurred in Jesus's ministry, this best gospel to go to would be the book of Luke and then the book of Acts following that Luke also authored. So that would be the way if you want to see a chronological listing of the events. The book of John and the other two books, Matthew and Mark, they don't necessarily order things chronologically. It wasn't something in the past that people necessarily had to do. They might have just put things down in the order of prominence or symbolism. And so that's just the way that they presented things. Here we go.
When did that occur? Mary Magdalene, after the resurrection of Jesus, runs to the disciples in John's Gospel and says, they've taken the Lord, and we do not know where they have put him. Strange thing for her to say if, as the Gospel of Matthew recounts, she's visited by an angel at the tomb who tells her exactly where Jesus is going, and then she's met by Jesus herself on the way to the disciples to bring them the news. Strange for her to then say that they've taken the Lord and we do not know where they've put him.
So let's go into that. I have reconciled the four accounts of Jesus' resurrection, and I have done that numerous times in other videos. So I won't belabor that. I won't read back exactly the way that those can be reconciled. But the idea is, again, there's an assumption by Alex here in that the accounts sort of frozen in time. In other words, Mary could not have possibly gone back and forth, with which actually I think is the only way to really reconcile it is first she showed up. She was the first to encounter Jesus, and there was an angel there. And so sometimes the Gospels mention one angel, sometimes two. That doesn't mean it's only one angel because we never see the word only. And we have Mary Magdalene back and forth. Sometimes she's with other women, like the other Mary. And so Jesus also appeared at a time when she was with the other women. And so Jesus was making multiple appearances to Mary and the other women. And Jesus also then, of course, appeared to the apostles. And the interesting thing is the account where he appeared to the 11 apostles, which was pretty interesting, was the point when in Mark, in the longer ending of Mark, he actually scolded them for their disbelief. So that was something that he did also in Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus. He scolded the two disciples, Clopas and probably Clopas' wife, Mary. But anyway, so here we go. We've got my explanation of this is this is not an event that's frozen when Mary could only go to this once and she just stood there the whole time and she never went back and forth. Mary went to the tomb, didn't see Jesus initially, went back, but she heard that, that what the angel said is he is not here, he has gone ahead. So then she went back, told the apostles that. Then she went back to the tomb, maybe with the other women, or maybe first by herself. She saw Jesus, she encountered Jesus. And then she, of course, went and told the other apostles that she had encountered Jesus. Then she went back to the tomb again, possibly with the other women, and Jesus then, of course, appeared again. So she had multiple appearances from Jesus. And so that's a pretty good thing. And so just understanding that this is a more dynamic event that took place over a period of time on Sunday morning. And that's that. So here we go.
There's more to say on this. Interpolations, things which seem not to be in our oldest manuscripts, but end up in newer manuscripts of the New Testament, such as the adulterous woman. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone.
St. Augustine talked about that particular verse. Now, that's John 7:53 to 8:11. Some people have said that that's not in our oldest manuscripts. However, there are numerous sources that are very early on that do talk about that. One source that actually talks about why sometimes you wouldn't see that verse was Augustine. And Augustine said that some people weren't comfortable with that verse because they thought that it gave women or people just a right to be an adulterer or an adulteress. And so that sometimes was removed. And so in some manuscripts, you wouldn't see that. But again, Augustine told us very early on that this was going on. And I think that gives a pretty clear explanation of why sometimes we don't see it in some sources and sometimes we do.
Most scholars agree that this was not in our earliest manuscripts and was added in at a later date. And if we can see that the gospel stories were edited after they were written down, there's no reason to think that they couldn't be edited before they were written down as oral traditions too, as well as the entire ending of Mark 16. There's a longer version and a shorter version, because the longer version simply isn't in our earlier manuscripts.
That's not entirely true. It's very unfortunate that Alex hasn't done a little digging on this Mark longer ending. Okay, so in the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, which were around the 4th century, so hundreds of years after the Gospels were written and the accounts were written, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus did not have the longer endings of Mark. However, around that same exact time, 3 other codices did have the longer endings of Mark. But even beyond that, what if I can show you that the longer endings of Mark came much earlier? So Eusebius recorded something that Papias said around 110 AD that related to the longer ending of Mark. Justin Martyr, around 150, also mentioned something in accordance with the longer ending of Mark. But I'm going to read you the most interesting one, as I think was written around 170 or 180 AD in chapter 10 of Irenaeus' 3rd book, Against Heresies. Here's what he says, and this is again around 170 or 180 AD. So very significant, very early, much earlier than what Alex is referencing. Here's what he says. Wherefore also Mark, the interpreter and follower of Peter, does thus commence his gospel narrative. Quote, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before your face, which shall prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make the path straight before our God. Plainly does the commencement of the gospel quote the words of the holy prophets and point out him at once, whom they confessed as God and Lord, him, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who had also made promise to him that he would send his messenger before his face, who is John crying in the wilderness, in the spirit and power of Elias. Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths before our God. For the prophets did not announce one and another God, but one and the same, under various aspects, however, in many titles. For varied and rich in attribute is the Father, if I have already shown in the book preceding this, and I shall show from the prophets themselves in the further course of this work. Also, towards the conclusion of his gospel, Mark says, so then, after the Lord had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sits on the right hand of God. That's from Mark 16:19. Now, the longer verses is Mark 16:9-20, and this is right towards the end. And then he says, confirming what had been spoken by the prophet. The Lord said to my Lord, sit on my right hand until I make your foes your footstool. Thus God and the Father are truly one and the same. He who was announced by the prophets and handed down by the true gospel, whom we Christians worship and love with a whole heart, as the maker of heaven and earth and all things therein. And so in summary, I believe that many of the supposed contradictions that Alex has brought up can easily be reconciled and also rebutted, like in the case with the longer ending of Mark. We've got evidence, again, going back to, as I mentioned, Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Jerome, and so on, and so on, and so on. I could go into many, many examples of why this is not a contradiction. And so I want to thank you for coming in today. I hope that if you like this kind of content, you'll like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Thank you.